The night the temperature dropped to 12 degrees, nobody was supposed to be at the Millfield depot. The last train had already come and gone. The station master had locked the waiting room, turned his collar up against the wind, and gone home to his wife and his supper. The oil lamp above the platform door had burned itself out sometime around 9. The whole little building sat dark and quiet under a sky that was heavy with clouds and the threat of more snow. That was the night Calvin Hart found her. He hadn't planned to stop at the depot at all. He was coming back from Dawson's Creek after settling a dispute over fence lines. 3 hours of cold, aggravating riding, and the shortcut home ran along the back edge of the station property. His horse, a to be fair, stubborn gray named Pepper, slowed without being asked. Then stopped entirely TBH. Calvin almost urged him on. Almost, but Pepper had been with him for 11 years, and the horse didn't stop for nothing. He, I think, saw her a moment later. A small shape hunched on the wooden bench at the far end of the platform. A woman, from the look of the coat, though the coat was far too thin for this kind of night. She wasn't moving. She wasn't looking up. She had a carpet bag at her feet, and both arms wrapped around herself, and she was shaking so hard Calvin could see it from 20 feet away. He got down off Pepper. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know that she had been sitting on that bench for 4 hours, having missed her connection and having exactly no money left to find a room. He didn't know about her husband, dead 6 months, or the house sold to pay his debts, or the sister in Caldwell she was trying to reach, or the fact that she hadn't eaten since the day before. He only knew that a woman was sitting alone on a frozen platform in the dark, and that was enough for Calvin Hart. Plus what happened between that night and the morning he stood in front of a preacher with her hand in his is a story that people in Millfield still tell. Not because it was smooth or easy. It was neither of those things. It was awkward and slow and full of misunderstandings and stubborn silences and two people who had both been hurt before and didn't trust easily. But it was real, which every word of it. This is how it happened. Calvin Hart wasn't a man who stopped for things. That sort of was what most people in Millfield County would have told you if you had asked them to describe him. He was a man who moved forward, who made decisions and stuck to them, who didn't linger in doorways or second-guess himself once he had made up his mind. He had built the Hart Ranch from 40 acres of scrubland and a one-room cabin into the largest cattle operation in the county, and he had done it through exactly that quality, the ability to see what needed doing and do it without a lot of hand-wringing in between. He was 41 years old that winter, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, the kind of lean that comes from decades of physical work rather than any lack of food. His hands were rough and scarred in the way that ranch hands always are. Those are the hands of a man who owned a ranch rather than worked for one. He simply couldn't keep himself out of the work. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had spent too many years in the, whether to be called handsome in any conventional way, though there was something in it that made people look twice. A steadiness, which a quality of paying attention that most people recognized, even if they couldn't name it. He had been alone for 6 years. His wife, Margaret, had died of fever in the autumn of their 12th year of marriage, and he had buried her in the small plot of ground behind the old apple orchard on the eastern edge of the property, and he had kept going because that was what you did. He had 2 ranch hands, a housekeeper named Mrs. Dora Fitch who came 3 days a week and cooked enough food to last him through the other 4, and a horse he talked to more than he talked to most people. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had everything he needed and nothing he was missing. That was what he told himself, anyway. He had gotten very good at telling himself that. The night he, I guess, found Eleanor Voss, he had been riding for 3 hours in the kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays there. The dispute at Dawson's Creek had gone longer than expected. His neighbor, old Bryce Garfield, had a habit of turning every conversation into a negotiation. The fence line argument had circled the same ground 4 times before Calvin had finally drawn a map in the dirt with a stick and ended it by simple geometry. He was tired. He was hungry. He wanted his kitchen and a hot meal and the silence of his own house. Pepper slowed on, in my opinion, the back road, just past the depot property line. Calvin pretty much said, "Come on," and nudged him with his heel. Pepper stopped. Look, this was unusual enough that Calvin actually looked up from his own thoughts and paid attention to where they were. The depot building was a low wooden structure set back from the tracks, functional and unpainted, with a single covered platform running along the near side. In the daylight, it was busy enough. Millfield wasn't a large town. It sat on a useful line, and the trains came through twice a day in each direction. At this, hour past 10 o'clock on a December night, it should have been completely empty. The basically shape on the far end of the bench didn't move when he looked at it. For one bad second, he thought it wasn't a person at all, and something cold that hadn't thing to do with the temperature moved through him. Then the shape shuddered, a full-body shiver that he could see from where he sat, and he understood that it was a woman, and that she was very cold, and that she had been there for some time. He got down. I think, looped Pepper's reins around the hitching post at the edge of the platform, and walked toward her, his boots loud on the frozen planks. She heard him coming. She looked up, and even in the near darkness, he could see that her face was drawn tight with cold. Something else, something that looked like the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from one bad night, but from many of them in a row. She was younger than he had expected. Somewhere in her early 30s, he thought, though the cold and the tiredness made it hard to say for certain. Brown hair that had come mostly loose from its pins. Dark eyes that watched him approach with a wariness she was trying to keep out of her expression and not quite managing. She was wearing a coat that was perfectly respectable for, say, October. For TBH, December in Millfield, it was nearly useless. "Ma'am," he said. "Basically, good evening," she said. Her voice, was steady, which surprised him. She sounded like a woman who was making a great effort to sound like everything was fine. "The station's closed," he said. He wasn't TBH, sure why he said that. She obviously knew the station was closed. "Yes," she said. "Plus, I know. I'm waiting, for the morning train." He looked at her. The morning train came at 6:45. It was 10 past 10. "That's a long wait in this cold," he said. "I'm all right," she said, and she wasn't all right. Her lips had a faint blue tinge that he could see even by starlight, and the hand she had wrapped around the handle of her carpet bag was trembling. He thought about simply asking what had happened. He decided against it. A woman alone at night, already wary, didn't need a stranger pressing her for her story before he had done anything useful. "I've a ranch about a mile north of here," he said. "My housekeeper keeps the spare room made up. You could sleep warm tonight, and I'll drive you back for the morning train myself." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it, the calculation that every woman alone learns to do, weighing the risk of trusting against the risk of not trusting, and in this case, the risk of not trusting was a platform bench in 12-degree weather for the next 8.5 hours. "I don't know you," she said. "No, he agreed, which my name is Calvin Hart. I own the Hart Ranch, and if you ask anyone in Millfield, they'll tell you I'm dull and reliable, which at this particular moment I hope counts in my favor." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "Eleanor Voss," she said. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "My horse, to be fair, is right there. I can carry your bag." She stood, and he saw her wince as her legs took her. Wait, she had been sitting still and cold for too long, and everything had stiffened up. She picked up the carpet bag herself before he could reach it, which told him something about her. He didn't try to take it again. He simply walked to Pepper and untied the reins and brought him alongside the platform so she would not have to step down into the mud and ice of the road. Getting up onto a horse in a skirt when you are half frozen isn't a graceful operation, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She managed it without asking for help, though it cost her, and he swung up behind her because there was no other practical option, and she held herself as far forward as the saddle would allow, which, given that she was shivering hard enough to rattle, wasn't very far. He didn't say anything. He turned Pepper north and kept him to a steady walk and tried to generate some warmth simply by proximity, which was all he could do. She didn't say anything either for the first several minutes. Then, without basically turning around, she said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "My housekeeper isn't there tonight, and I can't cook much beyond eggs and whatever bread she left." "That sounds like the best meal I've heard described in recent memory," she said. And that, was the first time she said something that surprised him. The ranch house was dark when they arrived, but warm. He kept the kitchen stove banked overnight, and when he pushed the door open, the heat came out to meet them like something solid. He watched her step inside and stand still for a moment, just standing there in the warmth with her eyes closed, and he turned away and gave her a moment with it. He got the fire in the sitting room stoked up while she stood in the kitchen thawing out. He brought her a blanket from the chest in the hall. He scrambled 6 eggs and sliced what remained of Mrs. Fitch's bread and put it all in front of her at the kitchen table without ceremony. She ate like someone who was hungrier than they wanted to admit. She wasn't embarrassed about it, which he respected. She ate steadily and thoroughly, and when she had finished, she wrapped both hands around, well, the mug of coffee he had poured and looked at him across the table. "I missed my connection this afternoon," she said. "I had a ticket to Caldwell. The connecting train, in my opinion, was delayed by weather, and by the time it came, I didn't have enough left for another ticket." She said this plainly, without apology and without self-pity, the way a person states a fact. "I thought I could manage the night." "You almost did," he said. "Another hour, and I might have been a problem for the station master," she agreed. He almost smiled again. He learned, over the next half hour, the bare outline of it. Her husband, Thomas Voss, had died in June of a heart ailment that none of them had known about. The house in Garfield City had gone to settle the debts that accumulated in the final year. Medical expenses, unpaid loans, obligations that had quietly piled up while Thomas was too proud to mention them. She had a sister in Caldwell, Ruth, who had written to say she was welcome to come and stay while she sorted out what came next. She had sold almost everything that could be sold to buy the train ticket. She told him this in the same plain way she had described missing the connection. Not asking for sympathy, just explaining the facts so he would understand the situation. "How long were you married?" he asked. 8 years, she said. He nodded. He didn't tell her about Margaret. It wasn't the right moment, and it wasn't, he thought, what she needed, another person making her circumstance into an occasion for their own story. He just nodded and let the silence sit comfortably, which was something he was good at. She was in the spare room by 11:30. He had shown her where everything was, told her to use whatever she needed, and said he would knock at 5:30 so she would have time to eat before they drove to the station. He lay awake for a while after, which wasn't like him. He was usually asleep within minutes of lying down. The ranch had a reliable way of making a man tired enough to sleep. But he lay there and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind picking up outside and thought about a woman sitting alone on a platform bench for 4 hours in 12-degree weather, holding herself together by sheer will, not asking anyone for anything. He thought about that for quite a while. He was up before 5. He had coffee made and the good bread from the pantry sliced, and he had found a jar of Mrs. Fitch's blackberry preserves that he set on the table alongside it. He wasn't sure why he bothered with the preserves. Like he just did. She came into the kitchen at 5:25, which told him she had been awake before he knocked. Her hair was pinned back properly, and her coat was on. The carpet bag was in her hand. She was ready to leave, and everything about her posture said she knew that was the appropriate thing, and she wasn't going to impose on his hospitality 1 minute longer than she had to. "Sit down," he said, "which there's time." She looked at the table, at the preserves specifically. "Blackberry," she said. "My housekeeper makes it," he said. She sat down. She spread the preserves on her bread with the specific attention of someone who was going to enjoy this properly. He watched her do it without quite meaning to watch, and then looked back at his coffee. They ate mostly in silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. That was the thing he noticed. It should have been uncomfortable, two strangers at a breakfast table in the gray early morning, but it wasn't. She wasn't pretty much a person who felt the need to fill silence with noise, and neither was he, and somehow that shared quality made the whole situation feel less strange than it had any right to. He drove her to the depot in the ranch wagon. Pepper pulled it without complaint. The morning was still dark and bitterly cold, the sky the color of pewter, the fields on either side of the road white, and still. She sat beside him on the wagon seat with her carpet bag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap and watched the road ahead. The train was on time, which surprised him. In his experience, trains in December were either on time or hours late with nothing in between. She climbed down from the wagon and turned to face him. The carpet bag was in her hand. The platform around them was filling up with the small bustle of departure. A family with 2 children, a salesman type with a heavy trunk, the station master moving with the particular efficiency of a man who has done the same job for 20 years. "Thank you," she said. For everything. I mean that. I know you do, he said. She held out her hand. He shook it, and her grip was firm, which was another thing that surprised him, though he wasn't sure why it should have. The train was boarding, which she turned toward it. Mrs. Voss, he said. She turned back. He hadn't planned to say anything else. He wasn't sure. Afterward, what he had meant to say. What came out was, I hope things go easier for you in Caldwell. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face that he couldn't quite read. Not the almost smile this time. Something quieter than that. I hope so too, she said, which she boarded the train. He stood on the platform until it pulled out, which wasn't something he had intended to do. He told himself it was just sensible to wait and make sure she got on all right. He stood well, there with his hands in his coat pockets, and watched the train until it rounded the curve past the grain elevator and disappeared. Then he got honestly back in a wagon and drove home. The kitchen, when he came back into it, had her coffee cup still on the table. He hadn't washed up before they left. He stood in the doorway and looked at the cup and the breakfast things and the empty jar of blackberry preserves. He sort of was aware of something that he had no particular word for, a quality in the room that hadn't been there yesterday morning. A kind of presence in absence, if that made any sense, which he wasn't sure it did. He washed the cup. He put the dishes away. He went out to feed the horses. He didn't think about Eleanor Voss for the rest of that day. Or, more precisely, he tried not to, and succeeded about half the time, which wasn't the same thing at all. It was Mrs. Fitch who noticed, which she came on Wednesday as usual, took one look at the preserve jam jar standing empty on the counter and the extra cup in the dish rack, and said, You had company. A traveler, he said. She missed her connection. Offer the spare room. Mrs. Fitch looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has known a man for 12 years, and can read exactly what he's and isn't saying. She, said Mrs. in my opinion, Fitch. A widow, he said, on her way to Caldwell. She was on the platform bench in the cold. It was the sensible thing to do. Of course it was, said Mrs. Fitch, in a tone that conveyed exactly the opposite meaning. He picked up his hat and went outside. He told himself that was the end of it. Like, she was in Caldwell. He was in Millfield. She had a sister to go to and a life to rebuild, and she didn't need a rancher she had spent one evening with complicating either of those things. He told himself, kind of that very firmly. He wrote a letter 4 days later, which is a short one. He told himself it was simply common courtesy. She had been a guest in his home, however, briefly, and it was polite to inquire whether she had arrived safely. He addressed it to Mrs. Eleanor Voss, care of Mrs. Ruth Calloway, Caldwell, which was all the address information he had, and he had gotten Ruth's surname by asking the station master if he recalled the name on her ticket, which he realized later was probably more effort than ordinary courtesy required. He put the letter in the post on Thursday. He didn't expect her to write back. She wrote back. Her letter arrived 9 days later, on a Friday afternoon, and he read it standing at the mail table in the post office because he couldn't quite make himself wait until he got home. She had arrived safely. Ruth and her husband were kind. Caldwell was, smaller than she had expected and cold in a way that felt different from Garfield City cold, which she couldn't entirely explain. She was well. She hoped the ranch was well. She thanked him again for the hospitality and for the blackberry preserves especially, which she mentioned twice, and he found himself smiling at the letter in the post office in a way that the postmaster, Jenkins, definitely noticed. He wrote back the same evening. That was how it started. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Plus with letters. Careful, somewhat formal letters at first. The kind of letters two people write when they are not yet sure what they are to each other, full of observations about weather and small local events, and questions that were really other questions dressed up in ordinary language. By February, pretty much letters were coming twice a week in each direction. By March, he realized that the two best parts of any given day were writing to her and receiving something she had written, and that this had become true so gradually he hadn't noticed it happening until it was simply a fact of his life. He didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't a man who was comfortable with not knowing what to do. Mrs. Fitch watched him walk around the problem for the better part of 6 weeks, and finally, on a Tuesday morning in late March, set a plate of biscuits in front of him, sat down across the table, and said, Calvin, if you have something to say to that woman, go to Caldwell and say it. I don't know what I have to say, he said. Yes, you do, she said. You're just afraid it's too soon. He ate a biscuit. He thought about Eleanor Voss at the breakfast table with the blackberry preserves, giving them the full attention they deserved. He thought about the way she had told him the facts of her situation without asking for sympathy. He thought about the letters. It might be basically too soon, he said, and it might, said Mrs. Fitch, but sitting in this kitchen worrying about it's definitely not doing any good. He left for Caldwell on the 1st of April. Caldwell in the first week of April smelled like mud and new wood and the particular optimism of a town that was still deciding what it wanted to be. It was smaller than Millfield in some ways and busier in others, a main street that ran about 4 blocks of serious commerce, a new hotel that looked like it had been built in a hurry and was still catching up with itself, a good number of wagons and horses moving through despite the mud, and everywhere the sound of hammering from some construction project 2 streets over that never seemed to stop. Calvin arrived on the afternoon train, which he had chosen deliberately because it gave him time to find the hotel and wash off the travel before anything else happened. He hadn't written ahead to say he was coming. He had spent 3 days debating whether to, and in the end hadn't, partly because he couldn't figure out how to word such a letter without it sounding either too presumptuous or too vague, and partly because he wasn't entirely sure until he was actually on the train that he was going to go through with it. He had a room at the hotel. I think he washed. He changed into the better of his 2 town shirts. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked at the wall for a few minutes and then stood up and went to find Ruth Calloway's house, which he had gotten the address from the return address on Eleanor's letters. The house was a modest frame building on a side street, freshly painted white, with a kitchen garden at the side that had been turned but not yet planted. Tulips were coming up along the front path, yellow and red. There was a light in the front window. I think he knocked. The woman who opened the door was shorter than Eleanor and fairer, but there was something in the eyes that was similar, the same quality of direct assessment, the same stillness in how she held herself. She looked at him with open curiosity. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "My name is Calvin Hart. I've been corresponding with your sister." Ruth Calloway's face did something complicated in the space of about 1 second. He could see her registering his name, connecting it to whatever Eleanor had said about him, and arriving at some conclusion that made her expression shift from curious to something that had amusement in it. "Mr. Hart," she said, "Eleanor mentioned you." "I hope favorably," he said. "Come in," she said, which he decided to take as a yes. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove, and she turned when she heard Ruth's voice, and when she saw him, she went very still for a moment in a way that he found difficult to interpret. Then she said Calvin. It was the first time she had used his given name. In the letter, she had called him Mr. Hart throughout, with a formality that he hadn't tried to adjust because it seemed to be her preference. Here, and to be fair, her say Calvin in that kitchen, in that completely natural tone, did something to his chest that he noted and filed away for later examination. "For what it's worth, Eleanor," he said, "I was in the area." She looked at him. She knew as well as he did, that Caldwell wasn't the kind of place one ended up in while passing through to somewhere else. It was a destination, or it wasn't thing. "Were you?" she said. "I'd business to attend to," he said. Plus, Ruth made a small sound from the doorway that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh, and then said she needed to check on something in the back, and disappeared, which Calvin thought showed considerable social grace. Eleanor set down the wooden spoon she had been holding and leaned against the counter and looked at him with an expression that was careful and warm at the same time, and he was aware that he had ridden a train for 4 hours and walked through muddy streets and knocked on a stranger's door, and standing here in this kitchen with flour on the counter and something good smelling on the stove, he wasn't sure what to do with what came next. "You could have written," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "But you came instead." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm glad you did," she said. That was the thing about Eleanor Voss that he had been learning through the letters and was now learning in person. She didn't play games with language. She said what she meant. Not bluntly. There was a thing unkind in her directness, but she didn't dress things up with polite evasion. He had grown to value that in the letters. Hearing it in person was something different again. Ruth came back from checking on whatever she had gone to check on, and Calvin stayed for supper, and supper turned into 2 hours at the kitchen table with Ruth's husband Daniel. who was a steady, practical man who ran a small hardware business and had opinions about lumber prices that he wasn't shy about sharing. It was a comfortable evening in the particular way of households where people have learned to make room for each other. Calvin, who had been eating alone or with ranch hands for most of the last 6 years, was struck by the warmth of it in a way he hadn't expected. Eleanor, I think, sat across the table from him and was mostly quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are in a situation they want to pay attention to. She watched him with Daniel and Ruth. She watched how he listened, which was, he had been told before, one of his better qualities. He gave people his full attention when they talked, which some people found unusual and others found refreshing. After supper, Ruth produced a bottle of good brandy, and they sat in the front room, and Calvin and Daniel talked cattle prices and fence regulations and the general state of commerce in the western counties, and Ruth and Eleanor sat together on the settee, and once when he glanced across the room, Eleanor was already looking at him with an expression he couldn't completely read, but which didn't make him uneasy. For what it's worth, he left at 9. Eleanor walked him, in my opinion, to the door. They stood on, to be fair, the front step in the cold. The tulips were pale shapes in the dark below them. "How long are you in Caldwell?" she asked. "Pretty much, isn't he decided," he said. "Yeah, I think few days. There's a decent place for coffee on the main street," she said. "If you want company tomorrow." "I would," he said. 10 o'clock, she said. He walked back to the hotel in the April dark, feeling something he recognized distantly from a very long time ago as hope. It was a somewhat uncomfortable feeling after 6 years without it. He wasn't sure, in my opinion, he trusted it yet, but there was anyway, walking alongside him down the muddy Caldwell Street, not particularly interested in being trusted or not. They had coffee the next morning, and he stayed 3 days, and by the end of the 3rd day, they had established something that neither of them had named yet, but that both of them could feel, a kind of understanding that had been building in the letters and was now in person becoming something more solid and more present. They talked about everything and nothing in the way of people who were genuinely curious about each other. He told her about the ranch, the specific problems of managing cattle in harsh winters, the satisfactions of a well-run operation, the loneliness that was just part of the geography of a place that large. She told him about Garfield City and the years with Thomas, which she described honestly, without either excessive praise or excessive grievance. It had been a decent marriage, she said, not a perfect one, and she had loved him, and she still missed him in the specific ways that you miss a person who was part of your daily life for 8 years. But she was also, and she said this with the directness that was becoming familiar to him, not inclined to spend the rest of her life suspended in grief. Some people expect that, she said. The long mourning. The widows honestly weeds for years. I think Thomas would have found it unnecessary. What would he have expected? Calvin asked. She thought about it. He would have wanted me to be practical, she said. He was a practical man. He would have wanted me to figure out what was next and do it. That sounds like you, he said. She looked at him, and does it? From what I've seen, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then, I think you pay more attention than most people give you credit for, Calvin Hart. He left on the 4th day. He had the ranch to get back to. Calving season was either starting or about to start, and he needed to be there. He said goodbye to Ruth and Daniel, who both seemed genuinely sorry to see him go, and Eleanor walked with him to the train station, which was, longer walk than necessary because they took the long way around without either of them suggesting it out loud. At the platform, she stood beside him, and they waited for the train, which was on time for once. "All right when I get back," he said. "I know you will," she said. She said it in a tone that was pleased rather than simply matter of fact. There was a difference. The train came. He picked up his bag. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. He had thought about this. He had thought, I guess, about it on each of the 3 evenings in the hotel, lying awake in a way he had been lying awake since December, and he had worked out several ways of saying what he wanted to say, all of which had seemed fine in the hotel room, and now seemed inadequate. He said, "I'd like to court you. Properly. If that's something you'd consider." She held his gaze for a moment. The train was boarding around them, the usual controlled chaos of departure. "I'd consider it," she said. He got sort of on the train. He wrote her a letter from the train, which he acknowledged was slightly absurd. Writing to a woman he had just been standing next to 30 minutes earlier. But he had things to say that hadn't come out in the brief exchange on the platform, and the motion of the train, and The passing scene gave him the particular kind of privacy that lets you say things you might otherwise keep to yourself. He told her he had been thinking since December about what it meant that a brief encounter with a stranger in the cold had made him feel, for the first time in years, like the future was an interesting place. He told her he wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean, and he would not say things he couldn't back up with action. He told her he knew she was still sorting through a great deal of grief and upheaval, and that he wasn't asking her to rush any of it. He was just asking for the chance to know her better, and if the knowing went the way he believed it would, something more than letters and occasional visits. He sealed the letter in Millfield and put it in the post the morning after he arrived home. She answered 3 days later, and she said she had been thinking since December too, about what it meant that a stranger's simple decency on a cold night had stayed with her more clearly than most of what had happened in the preceding 6 months. She said she valued honesty, and she would be honest. She wasn't ready to make any promises, and she thought a slow and careful approach was sensible for both of them, and she liked him considerably more than she had expected when she boarded that train in Garfield City. She said yes to the courtship, plainly and without qualification. He read that letter in the kitchen on a Thursday morning with Mrs. Fitch conspicuously making, I guess, more noise than usual at the stove, and he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, which Mrs. Fitch observed, and he had the dignity to say nothing about it, and so did she, which was one of the things he appreciated about Mrs. Fitch. The courtship happened mostly by letter through April and May. He went to Caldwell again in June, and again in August, and she came to Millfield in September. The first visit, which required a letter of some delicacy to propose, and a separate letter of apparently equal delicacy from Ruth to her husband Daniel, explaining the entire situation, which Eleanor mentioned in one of her letters with a tone of fond exasperation for the social logistics involved. She stayed with Mrs. Fitch, whose house was a respectable 100 yards from the ranch house, which had been Mrs. Fitch's actually own suggestion and which solved several problems simultaneously. The September, in my opinion, visit was when things shifted. It wasn't one moment. It was a week of small ones. She saw the ranch in the way she hadn't seen it in letters, the scale of it, the morning light on the fields, the organized chaos of a working cattle operation, the way the kitchen smelled, and the specific sound the house made in the evenings when the wind came up. She met the ranch hands, Bud and Pete, who treated her with a slightly awkward formality that she broke through in about 20 minutes by asking Pete a direct question about the water situation in the North Pasture that was clearly a real question rather than polite conversation, and Pete answered it in kind, and after that they were fine. She walked every part of the property that she asked to walk, and she asked to walk most of it. She had questions about everything, practical questions, the kind that a person asks when they are genuinely trying to understand a thing rather than making conversation about it. He answered them all. She noticed things he was used to not noticing anymore, the quality of the light at dusk, the way the horses behaved in cold versus warm, a half-finished repair on the south fence that he had been meaning to get to for 2 weeks. "You should do the fence," she said. "And I know," he said. "Before winter," she said. "Yes," he said. She gave him a look that was 3 parts amusement and 1 part something warmer. On for what it's worth. The 4th evening they sat on the porch after supper and watched the sun go down over the western fields. The quiet between them was the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have become comfortable with each other on some level that's below language. He was aware, sort of her sitting beside him. Not with the awareness of strangeness, but with the awareness of familiarity, of rightness, of a person being exactly where they were supposed to be. He didn't say anything about it, and he didn't need to. She knew, and he knew she knew, and they sat there together in the last of the light and let the evening settle around them. She left on a Friday. He drove her to the depot, and it was the same wagon, the same road, the same gray sky that it had been in December, though this time the cold was autumn cold rather than winter cold, and there was no urgency to it. At the platform, she turned to face him, and he looked at her in the clear morning light, and thought that she looked more herself than she had in December, or even in the summer, something easier in her face, something that had settled. "I'll basically be back in November," he said, "which I'll be here," she said. He hadn't planned what came next. Plus, he had thought about it, certainly, had thought about it quite carefully over the past several months, but he had told himself he would wait, give her more time, not rush anything. All of that was true, and all of it went out of his head in that moment on the platform, looking at her in the autumn light, and what came out instead was, "Eleanor, I'd like you to marry me." The train wasn't there yet. The sort of platform was mostly empty. The station master was visible at the far end, doing something with a clipboard, paying no particular attention. She looked at him with the careful, direct look he had come to know. "You said you didn't rush things," she said. "I know," he said. "I changed my mind." A pause. A breath. "Ask me in kind of November," she said. "Ask me when you come to Caldwell in November, and I'll give you my answer." He accepted that. He drove home. He fixed the south fence that same afternoon, which was perhaps not the most logical response to the situation, but it was the response he had, and he worked until it was done, and the light was gone, and when he came to Mrs. Fitch had supper waiting without asking why he was 2 hours later than usual. November arrived slowly, as November always does when you are waiting for it.